right, with that, let's kick off. We are recording this session. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. Today, we have a very special Ask Me Anything session with the incredible Sally Clarke. To get started, I'll just run us through our agenda for today and some housekeeping, and then we'll go straight into the AMA. So I'll start off with a little bit of intro to Medoo and to Sally, especially for anyone who is new and hasn't met us before. And then we'll kick off the AMA with some pre-prepared questions that we to get us started. And then we'll throw open to audience questions. And as an audience member, if you've got any questions, please add them to the chat. You can access the chat at the bottom right-hand corner. Feel free to have chats in there, but also add your questions in there and we'll go through them one by one. So quickly, a little bit about us. We are Medoo. We are a coaching technology startup based in Sydney, Australia. You can check out our software and our blog through our website, www.medoo.life. We also organize regular events to bring the coaching community together. I was just saying earlier that all our events have been in-person events. So this is our first online event, which we're very excited about. The photos that you see on the slide here are from a couple of in-person events we organized last year. About Sally, this is so exciting for me. Sally is an incredible human. We're thrilled to be able to do this deep dive with her today. She is a burnout recovery coach, co-director of Human Leaders, a podcast host, author of 2 books on burnout, and so much more. She's one of our earliest supporters of Medoo, so we're very, very grateful to share this journey with her and with Human Leaders. With that, over to you, Sally, to add anything you like to the intro. And also, if you could share a little bit about your journey into coaching, what excited you about it, and how did you take your first steps as a coach?
Thanks so much for the introduction, Paul. And so, yeah, it's lovely to meet everyone. I'm Australian born, as you can probably hear. And I was an exchange student in the Netherlands when I was 16 years old, and then went back to Australia to study. Ended up coming back to Europe on a one-way ticket after I'd finished law school, and 20 years later, I'm still here. And I think so. My journey really was, having been a finance lawyer and going through a burnout, I started to really evaluate what was important to me for the first time, and I was 32 at that point. So I'd spent quite a lot of years really just kind of living according to, I think, what my parents thought was important, the kind of measures that society had, including things like status and prestige. And the firm that I was working at was one of the most sort of prominent and prestigious in Europe. So it was, I was really sort of very much looking for sort of external validation at that time. And then the journey of my own burnout recovery, which took, a couple of years, not only for the physical recovery, but also for the kind of almost reset that I went through in terms of who I am, what my values are, and how I want my life to look, led me to becoming a yoga and meditation teacher. And I moved to Morocco for a while. I taught yoga and meditation at surf schools there, and I ended up running a business teaching yoga freelance. And I found that actually what I enjoyed most about teaching yoga were the conversations that would happen after class, when people would often be feeling, I think, quite vulnerable and be sharing things about where they were in their journey. And I realized that that's probably where my skill set lied. As much as I love teaching yoga, it was really that sort of those conversations that open up more questions for us. So that led me to do a couple of trainings in coaching, and I started coaching particularly, or I sort of started actually really just as kind of a life coach, not really knowing what my niche was or where my speciality would be. But very quickly it became evident that it was kind of helping people mid-career who kind of were going through a similar situation to me, whether that was actual burnout or simply a reassessment of what matters to them. One of the great things that I love about being a coach is being able to do that from different places. So in the last 10 years, I've been in Morocco, Portugal, Australia, Brazil, and California, and the Netherlands. And so being able to work with clients, sort of wherever they are around the globe, and being able to build rapport online has been a really important part of my coaching journey. I love holding space for people on this journey and giving them the sort of the support perhaps that they need, and being able to sort of bring, I guess, my unique skills to help them to grow and evolve. And I think my favorite thing is almost like the last coaching session, and I say that because it just makes me really pleased when I can see that people, my clients have a sense of groundedness and self-awareness, and they feel confident to move forward without needing a coach anymore. So that's kind of me. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded.
Not at all. That was great context. Thank you, Sally. And that international experience as a coach is incredible. And that's why we think you're so uniquely placed to talk about today's topic. So what we'd love to do to get us started is to hear your observations on the coaching culture in Europe and Australia. Um, when I say coaching culture, I'm talking about people's attitudes towards coaching. Any differences or similarities you've noticed in the types of challenges they hope to overcome with the help of coaching. And then the second part of that is the business side of coaching, acquiring your first clients, any economic differences or growth trends that you're observing there. So if we can kind of, I know that's quite a lot, but we can break that down and start off with like comparing coaching cultures in Europe versus Australia. If I may add my little observation to, get us going. I think that there is a bit more of an openness towards coaching and asking for support where you need it in Europe compared to in Australia. That could just be me and my anecdotal experience, but I'd love to, hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Paula. And I think I would just like to preface this by saying that what I'm going to share with you is really my own anecdotal experience as well. I'm not an academic. I've had a little bit of a look around in preparation for our conversation today, but there's not a great deal of data on exactly what those differences are. So it really is sort of my own experience. And just so the audience is aware, like I have spent quite a bit of time back in Australia in recent years, as well as in Europe. But again, it's really just kind of my vibe, if you will. My sense is, I think what you mentioned is correct, Paul, that there is perhaps a little bit more of an openness to coaching as a concept and that sort of support process in Europe. Probably I'm speaking particularly to the Netherlands because most of my client base is either Dutch or based in the Netherlands. When I actually went through my burnout in 2010, so 13 years ago, coaching was already an established field, and there were already even burnout coaches available. A part of that is probably in the Netherlands, driven by the fact that there is a quite extensive legislation around burnout and around other mental health, challenges that we face in the work environment. So I think to that extent, it has been more normalized as something to reach for. I think also, and I grew up in country Australia, and it was very much hard work, hard yakka, don't talk about your problems. And so the culture that I came from was very much just keep grinding and really, really sort of moving forward, working hard. And I obviously took that then to a corporate law environment, and that resulted in my own burnout. But I think sort of that was my experience, at least in Australia, and I think perhaps a little bit more hesitance to show weakness, or even reaching out to a coach as a weakness. I think in my experience with clients here, and even talking about it, with organizations that I work with, it just feels much more normalized and almost quite to the point where there are concerns have been raised about the number of coaches that there simply are registered in the Netherlands at this point. And it's almost it makes me think a little bit, having been a yoga teacher and seeing and sort of feeling like sometimes when there's a glut of people teaching yoga, it can dilute the power of what we do. So I think that's kind of almost the place that we've reached in the Netherlands, of needing to make sure that coaching is, to the extent possible, regulated, and that people are really delivering a good product and not undermining clients in any way. But what I have noticed recently is I I think there's been quite a strong shift in Australia towards awareness of things like burnout, and more of a willingness, I think, to seek support even before we burn out, which is really encouraging to see. And that's actually, I think, been almost a leap. And I'm not sure if that's pandemic related. I'm not sure if that's simply, the sort of digital transformation, this age that we're going through, that's shifting perhaps at a faster rate. But I think that's really encouraging to see that there is perhaps that taboo against seeking help and support is starting to unravel in Australia as well. And I certainly hope that sort of anecdotal experience that I'm having is also, generally the case.
Yeah, the point around regulation and I guess the rules around workplace culture is a very interesting one to compare. So if we can quickly touch on that a little bit, because you mentioned that coaching has been available in the Netherlands, at least for quite a long time, and there is regulation around burnout and mental health in the workplace. What does that look like? Are you able to share some examples of that regulation, and what does that look like in the Netherlands, so we can understand that better?
Certainly, Pauline. So even when I went through my burnout 13 years ago, there was already a legislation that had been introduced in the decade before that basically some fundamental things. One, it puts the onus for responsibility for burnout on the employer. So that was on the place that I was working. It means that you can you see a doctor, and if the doctor assesses you as being in burnout, you go on sick leave, and you're entitled to up to 2 years of sick leave at full pay to recover from burnout. Now there is the regulatory system here it's amazing, because it really gifts it makes burnout, it sort of validates the experience. You feel like you're actually not just making something up. You can actually own what you're going through, and allowing that time for and Miranda's just asking if there are diagnostic criteria. There are. I'm not a medical doctor, so I'm not familiar with the exact criteria, but there is that. This is all part of the sort of the regulatory process to sort of the assessment that's done by a company doctor. And I think sort of that framework existing then gives rise to, very naturally, because it's the employer's responsibility, they will also be working with you to get you back sort of reintegrated to work. And this, in some ways, brings up some complexities for some of my clients as well, because they feel they may experience a sense of pressure to come back. And depending on the relationship they have with, example, for their manager, there can be kind of some pros and cons to that process as well. But I think conceptually, the fact that it is, it's really acknowledged as a syndrome, as something that happens to people in the workplace, and B, putting the onus on the employer for having caused it, and therefore for supporting through recovery, is a really important one. And I think one of the things I hear as a bit of a pushback sometimes is that people say, people are just taking advantage of the system. And I think, that makes me quite angry because really statistically, the number of people who fake a burnout, and this has been measured, there is data around this, is incredibly small. And I think it's, to my mind, it's much more important that there is this regulation, there is this space for acknowledgement and healing, at the risk of maybe one or two people taking advantage of it. But for thousands of people, it is a very helpful framework.
Yes, I think there's also quite a lot of data that shows that the Netherlands and some of the European countries and Nordic countries are the happiest in the world. It's the best place, or among the best places in the world to raise children, and all of quite a lot of that is down to the regulation that exists around workplace culture. And I think that's a whole big topic that we could dive into on its own almost. And it's I love that topic as well, comparing what we can learn from countries that have such a good experience for their people, I suppose. One of the topics, Sally, that was top of mind for a lot of coaches when we talk to them about organizing this session was the acquisition of clients or finding their first clients and continuing to find clients. So maybe if you could walk us through your first steps as a coach. What was it like to find your first clients? How did you go about doing that? And then secondly, again, are you seeing anything different across, you've obviously worked in California as well, so perhaps you could compare all three, Europe, the US, particularly California, and over here in Australia.
Yeah, that's a great question, Paul, and I think it's one that it's sort of, again, it's probably going to look a little bit different for each person depending on their circumstances. For me, it was a matter of, so part of my training was also to do sort of test coaching with clients on a voluntary basis. So, which was a wonderful experience, and being supervised through that was really foundational to building those really important sort of fundamental skills as a coach. And so for me, it was really kicked off really word of mouth. I think having also built up a reasonably strong network from teaching yoga and my travel, I had quite a few people sort of reach out, and then building, through that, making sure that my website reflected some of their, their testimonies, and just making sure that I was sort of getting word out there, and then through LinkedIn. So I've been very lucky for it primarily to be pretty organic. And I've noticed in sort of speaking with friends in Australia who are in the coaching space, that it can be quite hard work. It's quite a competitive market from what I understand. And that, I think, where we can find a sort of our niche, the more specific we can be about the kind of coach that we are, the kind of person that we're trying to help, really getting clear on, I guess, who that client is really helpful as well to differentiate us from the group. I was in California for 1.5 years, and I don't have a vast amount of experience there. And my feeling there is that everyone has a coach. It is so normalized. Some people have multiple coaches. So that's something where, again, I think it can feel scary to kind of lean into our niche as if we're going to sort of close out other markets. But I think when we do, it can be a really powerful process, because it helps us lean into our own strengths, perhaps our own experience, and it will actually set us apart from the sort of the glut of sort of more general, I'm a life coach who wants to help people, which is a very admirable thing to be and to want, but to be more specific about that, I think, really empowers us. And I think finally, what I have noticed in Europe is I've had quite a lot of sort of platforms reach out to me to see if I want to be sort of on their website as a kind of, not a Tinder, but a kind of like a matching platform. And I did early on subscribe to a couple of them, and I just found I didn't get any clients through that. And I'm sure there are really great platforms that do act as a powerful conduit in that sense. But my own personal experience was not particularly successful there. So I've sort of stepped away from that modality personally.
Yeah, that's really great insight. Thank you, Sally. I have, I guess, one side point I wanted to share with people, which is that Medoo, we don't do that matching, and we decided not to do that intentionally. However, as a client, I suppose, or as a coachee who is looking for help, where would you say someone who is looking for help should go to get started? Like, what does that process look like? What is I guess a quick or a shortcut or the fastest way perhaps to find somebody who you can connect with and work with as your coach?
That's a great question, Paul, and I think, again, it's probably going to be a little bit different for everyone depending on what they're looking for. So I think beyond sort of immediately sort of asking around in your network, Google searching, that's when, in me finding my own, therapists and coaches during my life has really come from that sort of approach. And I really, I haven't really seen a lot of, I'm not going to sprout any of the coaching platforms, because I really haven't seen any that has stood out to my mind as being a really impressive sort of conduit. So I think like leaning into your own network, reaching out, and asking if you have heard of any of your friends who are working with coaches. I honestly think, and I get asked this quite often, and I feel kind of almost embarrassed that I don't have a go-to, like, this is where you should go. But I think because it's such a personal journey, that the process of actually Googling and refining and investigating for yourself, getting a feel for the person that you might be working with, because the coaching relationship, it is a relationship. We haven't, it is a human to human relationship. So feeling a connection with that human and a trust in that human is going to be key to the success of that process. So a bit of research, I'm sorry, that's probably a very boring answer, but doing a bit of legwork will, I think, pay off.
Not at all, not a boring answer at all. And we actually often get asked for recommendations. So while it's not our primary role, we do try to make connections as much as we can. And we enjoy doing that because, like you said, it is so personal. And people come to us because they trust us and trust our recommendations. Veronica has a great question, which was kind of the train of thought in my head as well, which is the niching down or finding your niche aspect. How would you normally recommend someone find that niche, or how, like, articulating that niche? What was that process like for you? And then secondly, again, on that topic of comparing across continents, any trends you're observing in Europe versus here in Australia?
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Veronica, for sharing. I think for me, the niching it's actually a really exciting process, because it really means, it sounds so selfish, but it's actually quite an internal process. It's almost like, we can identify our own values, what matters to us in life, how we want our life to look. These are important processes that I went through and that I have support clients to go through. But I think in finding our niche, it's almost taking that self-discovery journey a little deeper. And really looking closely at the topics that really interest you, the kind of conversations that interest you, the kind of questions that make your heart shine, and looking also at your own experiences. And I think that combination of looking at, of course, coaching is not just about what we've been through, but I think noticing what sort of we're naturally drawn to, whether that's, and I think that's not an overnight process. That can be an ongoing one, and that might also evolve sort of through our life. But really leaning into that journey of self-discovery, I think is a great way to identify what that niche might be. And sorry, the second part of the question, across continents. Yeah.
So I think trends. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the trend that I'm seeing, I've had, like, the number of people who've reached out to me for burnout coaching from Australia in the last year has really exploded, and I think that's down to probably increasing media attention to burnout, which in itself sort of, I think, validates that experience to some extent. People recognize that in themselves, particularly, I think, I want to use the term post-pandemic, but sort of post-pandemic, that there is this recognition that times are challenging, and B, it's good and healthy to ask for support. So that's been something I've noted in Australia that I think has reasonably remained quite steady in Europe and the US for me in terms of clientele.
Yeah. Another, like, I don't want to go off into side tangents, but that's another, like, I know there's a gold mine there if we dig in. But I did notice Isabel had a question, and that was also a topic that I wanted to cover, which is coaching in the context of leadership within a company. So as a manager or a people leader, you do have a coaching role that might not be the biggest, or that it is a big part of your role, but it isn't all of your role. And often managers who adopt coaching principles, understand what the difference is between coaching and management, are the ones who are very successful in bringing out the potential of their team and delivering great results. So in that context, again, how have you seen that evolve? I suppose the responsibility, the coaching responsibility for a people leader within an organization. And Isabel's question in particular is, what are the potential downfalls of that approach in comparison to seeking out an external coach?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I feel like we could go all night talking about that. There's so many interesting little sort of nuances of coaching, and for me, it's a really exciting development that we're starting to see much more attention being paid to coaching skills as an integral part of leadership. I think historically, and to that extent in the Netherlands, again, back when I was an employee, so we're talking 13 years ago, but that was very much an external thing. If you need coaching, you go there. If you need that sort of support, you go there. Your manager just tells you what to do, certainly in the law firm that I worked at. So I think there is there's a real shift in how we're talking about leadership, the kind of skills that leaders bring. And as you know, this is something we work in a very hands-on way with human leaders. I think it's really important for leaders to develop those skills, particularly listening, framing questions to support individuals. And also I think retaining, this is an important part of coaching, because I'm sure everyone on the call, knows you're retaining that distance and objectivity for your client or for your team member when they perhaps don't have that, is a really core component of it. And that also includes perhaps observing when the way that I'm, as a manager, supporting this person is perhaps not a fit. Perhaps they do need some additional external support. Maybe they would benefit from that. So being able to sort of identify when, simply as a leader, you can support a person through using coaching skills and techniques in their journey as part of the team, and when perhaps it's a moment to perhaps think about using your EAP or reaching out to an external coach to get that more direct one-on-one confidential sort of support. And that, I think, is part of that is another sort of leadership capacity that we can develop, which is attunement to the individual needs, good listening skills, and that retaining that objectivity. And I think what Isabel was speaking to, like the potential downfall is I think two things. One is if we as leaders then start to feel that we have perhaps an outsized responsibility towards team members, really drawing boundaries, I guess, for ourselves as leaders as well, in a healthy way, is important, so that we're not feeling like we are actually all of our team's coach and only coach. And I think that's something to keep in mind. And also the downfall, I guess, potentially feeling like feeling a sense of outsized responsibility to that person when leadership is also a journey of support to your team, and I think being able to have open conversations as a leader with the person, with your team members, including around the support that they're getting and the support that they need, is really important. So it's definitely one to be. I think it's one of those things where it's like, it's awesome that we are seeing this integration of coaching skills into leadership, but leaders don't have to be qualified coaches necessarily either. There are definitely enormous things that a coaching process can bring that wouldn't necessarily occur in a sort of a employee leader relationship.
Yeah, that's a very good point, in that sometimes it can be hard to swap those hats as a leader, where you have to put on your coaching hat and look at it a certain way, look at a certain situation with that coaching lens, and you might have to take that hat off and look at it with a different lens, and that the conflict between those two can be, or finding the balance between those two can be quite tricky, I think. So yeah, I loved what you said about being aware of when is it appropriate to ask for external help, and making sure that that is available to people when they need it.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Paul. And I think for those of us who are, recovering people pleasers as well, we need to just be really aware that of those boundaries. I think also, the journey of self-leadership, building our skills, building our sense of trust, confidence in what we're doing, And this often comes with experience as well. It really empowers us to, I think, be more confident when we're drawing those boundaries. And I think also, you know, the most evolved leaders that I see, there really is no switching between those hats. It's really a very integrated kind of process, and I think that's something I aspire to in my own leadership as well.
Yes, yeah, no, that's a very good point. Um, that evolved sense of leadership where it's not an active like oh, now I'm a coach, now I'm not a coach. No, it's much more integrated, and it's a single experience. That's really awesome. Would love to again dig into that heaps more, but we are coming up to, I guess, opening up to the floor, but we do have a couple more questions that came from Veronica, pre-prepared questions, etc., which I think would be very interesting for people. And the first one is, how can we learn from Europe, California, these overseas coaching cultures? What can we learn, and how can we learn so that we can build up a great coaching culture, community, and industry here in Australia? Perhaps we can learn from some of the mistakes that were made, or we can learn from the things that went really well. In particular, looking at it from the lens of an individual coach, what are some pointers, tips, or advice you would give?
Yeah, great question again. And I think, you know, there was a lot of, you know, even as far back as sort of 2013, 2014, there was already press around a sort of, I think, mistrust or distrust of the coaching profession, some questions being raised in the UK, in the US. And I think, you know, there were even some situations that kind of verged on almost a pyramid scheme that really did a lot of damage to the reputation of coaches in the US. And I think the learning that I would take there, and you know, as individual coaches, is to really hold ourselves to a high standard of accountability for who we are and how we coach. That's at a very sort of purely individual level, to really make sure that it's almost like, I think it sort of feeds into also our sense of confidence in what we do, who we are, and what we bring, that is essential to finding and retaining clients, to building you know, building a career through coaching. It does entail really a fundamental belief that what I'm doing has an impact and makes a difference. And how am I also holding myself accountable to make sure that I'm delivering the highest, you know, standard of coaching to my clients? And perhaps, you know, that's also a conversation that we don't necessarily need to have alone. I think when you perhaps are, if you are a member of a group of coaches, or you have a network there, to sort of be talking about, you know, how can we, I guess on two levels, one sort of as a profession, make sure that we're holding ourselves accountable, and also, you know, how can we also keep developing ourselves and learning from ourselves, from the process, and from each other, to sort of create that sense of accountability. And I think, you know, I think in Australia, the new psychosocial risk and hazard regulations that are coming in are going to create an interesting shift, at least from a workplace perspective, around support for individuals and responsibility from employers. Obviously different to the regulations in the Netherlands that we talked about earlier, but I think that will also, you know, when we can really, and sometimes I have to think, you know, I'm a former lawyer, so I come from this very rules-obsessed sort of mentality, which made it, you know, I was very much about getting my papers. I have to be accredited and all that kind of thing with life coaches and with coaching. But I think it is important for us to have those kind of standards, and, you know, eventually, I think coaching will be a really quite a normalized part of an employee's life. In Australia, certainly for the younger generations, I think there's a real call for it, and not only a call for it, but I think there's, you know, amazing things will happen when that it does become you know, a normal part of our careers, to have that kind of support. So I think it's an exciting time, and it's also, you know, there are things that we can do as individuals, but I would also really encourage people to lean into community in this process as coaches as well, because it can be sometimes, you know, quite a solitary journey, which is why I love that you guys are organizing in-person events as well, to really bring people together. That community is so important when we're facing challenges. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And we love these conversations. So we're very honored that we get to bring the community together. I think there was a nice segue there into qualifications and certifications, as you mentioned. Quite a lot of the coaches we speak to have certifications from various different organizations. Some of them have degrees from universities in coaching psychology. So I guess one of the other questions, again from Veronica, thanks for the great questions, Veronica, is what are some qualifications that you think are highly valued overseas? And are there any specific ones that you would recommend, perhaps, or you can point people to who are looking to get qualified?
Yeah, I think that's a great question again. Thank you, Veronica. I think, the main one that I generally see here is ICF accredited sort of programs. So anything aligned with that, I think it's a body that has quite a lot of you know impact here in Europe and is well respected. So I think that as a general starting point, perhaps for exploring international certifications. And yeah, I think, anything, especially anything from a university, I think is certainly going to be, any body that has some substance to it, basically, I think will be a good place to start. But ICF, I think, is one that I see most commonly in Europe.
Thanks, Ellie. Veronica, if you have any other questions related to the qualifications, or anyone else, if you've got questions related to qualifications, please throw them in the chat. A couple of last questions from us is, would you say that, say in Europe or in the US, there's interest in Australian coaches? Like, that there's interest in having coaches help them who are based in Australia or in other countries. And I guess more broadly, like, because that question sort of sparked a broader thought in my head, is what can we learn from that cross-cultural coaching, I suppose? What would you say is the value of that?
It's a great question, and it's a big one. I have like 20 different thoughts. I'm going to try and stick to a couple. One is, I think, acknowledging or realizing that there are, we're, in some ways, humans are incredibly similar, and in some ways we also have some fairly fundamental, differences in perspective, in background, in approach to things. So I think, for example, for an Australian coach looking to go international, there are a lot of strengths that I think that the sort of the unique Australian approach may have. I would definitely recommend, there's a book called The Culture Map, which sort of explores some of the research around cultural differences. And I've found that quite helpful, not only in terms of coaching, but in working with leaders to kind of have that little bit of understanding of what their cultural background might be. It is important. And I think these days there's a real willingness, I've very rarely have I ever had someone reach out and have the fact that I'm Australian or that I'm based somewhere in particular be an issue. I think really it's about, as I said, it's that human to human relationship that coaching, innately is, means that doesn't need to be sort of a boundary. I think you can really, if it's something that you want to do, absolutely reach out and see if there's a market out there more broadly. And there can be some advantages from time zone perspective, or you can, there are ways that we can kind of use that as a real advantage rather than necessarily something that's a negative as well. So I think cultural awareness, and I think these days, if you're good at what you do and you believe in yourself, there's really no borders anymore.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think since I've been more active on LinkedIn, I've noticed that as well, the cross-cultural sharing of knowledge and context and experiences and stories around life and work has been really cool on LinkedIn. I know sometimes people say it's a bit cringe, but I love it. I love it when people share
Oh,
their
I'm
life
so here for
history.
that, Paul. And I think, having, like, I grew up in country Australia, but I speak, Japanese, Dutch, some Arabic, French. Like, I've always been, I love culture. I love the differences, and I love finding ways where we can stay in the same space, hold the same space, and have our differences, but also find connection too. And I think coaching is a really powerful tool for doing so. I mentor a couple of young people in Morocco from the time that I lived there, and I really enjoy that as well. And they're great because they also, I can ask questions about the the sort of the differences, and they'll explain quite candidly, and then do the same for me. So I think we can actually have quite a big impact in breaking down some of the barriers between different countries when we can create, sort of healthy, relationships and business relationships as well. And if anyone is looking to, to expand into Europe or something, would like it to have a chat separately, like, let me know. I'm here for that. Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Sally. I do have a few more things that were on our list of questions, but like Alad is saying, we'll open it up to the floor. Just give people a couple of minutes to put in any questions they have in the chat. If there is also a Q&A option. If people want to ask their questions anonymously, you can do that as well. So if you don't want to put it in the chat and you want to ask it anonymously, there is a Q&A option, which is under activities, again, in the bottom right. So yeah, meanwhile, we have a question from Veronica, which is, how would you go about working with people overseas from a pipeline perspective? I'd love to work with people overseas. She's got a strong domestic practice and now looking to expand internationally. How would you go about building that pipeline?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there's a few different approaches you can take. I guess identifying first. Thanks, Veronica. It's lovely to be here. I think first identifying, sort of, be specific as you can about your who you are and what you do, what your niche is, what your product is, as it were. And then getting really clear about the market that you'd like to get into. My experience is, and this is sort of more generally in sort of in terms of leadership, but I'm sure the same goes for coaching, people are quite willing to have a chat. If you're interested in a particular market and you can see someone, for example, on LinkedIn is active in that market as a coach, reaching out for a 15-minute quick catch up just to sort of understand maybe, what the national body might be for coaching, or a couple of, commonly used websites or forums for coaches in that particular country can be a really good place to start. So I think being very specific about who you are, what you're bringing, and then sort of targeting quite specifically. And I think, and you sort of alluded to this earlier, Paul, but I feel like also just through, this is not plugging LinkedIn, but LinkedIn for me has been a really interesting way of actually connecting with quite a lot of people in different communities in different countries, having conversations. And not that it always leads to something, but sometimes it does. And that can be a really interesting forum as well. Sort of do your own research, for example, Google, it's great, but also reaching out to people and to understand a bit more perhaps about that specific market. I'd also advise, like, sort of for yourself, thinking really quite clearly about what's my goal in entering that market. What do I want to achieve? And sort of be quite mindful for yourself about your motivation and also your vision for what that will then look like, without coaching you about coaching. Sorry.
Oh, amazing. Thanks for that, Sally. I'm learning a lot too from this chat. Does anyone else have questions for Sally?
Or if anyone has observations, I'd love to hear if anyone else has experience sort of with the different, coaching to different cultures as well. That'd be interesting for me too.
think we covered everything. All the questions have been answered. um, this is oh yes, so Veronica says that she specifically chose her coach because she's American to get that different mindset, and I totally understand that. Sometimes looking at it from that total like outside perspective can be so valuable, and that is, you know, most of coaching in a way. Looking at things from a different perspective and holding a mirror. Thanks, Kelly, for your comment on looking to expand, and this has been great. Thank you for that as well. So maybe, Sally, while we have 10, 10 more minutes, I might ask you a couple of sort of meta questions, which I love kind of pondering over. And the first is the future of coaching. You mentioned a few things around younger generations being more open to that. And so where do you see coaching going, and how do you see the interplay of coaching, the hustle culture, our experience with burnout, all interacting in the future? And then, of course, again, putting that lens of cross-continental, like Europe versus Australia lens. How are you seeing things evolve in Europe versus Australia? Are there any differences or things we can learn from each other?
Thanks, Paul. And this is like my favorite when we actually get to ask big, funky, cool, almost philosophical questions in these situations. So I'm really grateful for this space and for everyone sharing this conversation. I think, you know, I presented last week to a group of 1,700 young professionals at an organization in Australia about burnout prevention. And so that for me really got me thinking about how differently, you know, everyone's individual. I'm making a big generalization here, but this instinct that I get that the younger generation, the people of that age, sort of early 20s at this stage, are much more curious about those really key questions that coaching can shine a light on than was the case when I was that age. And I think that makes me so excited. I think what I'm also seeing is that there's that curiosity, but there is still quite a lot of there is still that kind of hustle culture, and I think coupled with it, this sense that we have to make it alone. I should be able to do this alone. I should be completely independent. So I think if we can bring coaching into organizations and bring it into, I think almost, you know, not the workplace directly, but make it a part of careers at an earlier stage for as many people as possible, it means that those fundamental questions about who we are, what matters to us, how we want our life to look, are being answered earlier. And that just makes me so happy, because I think that will have a flow-on effect of preventing so much burnout, creating more sustainable careers, and actually, you know, putting people in a position to really be present in their lives, whether that means, particularly I'm just imagining the trajectory of someone doing that in their early 20s and then becoming a parent perhaps in their early 30s, not having been through burnout, not going through burnout, being able to be much more present with their partner, with their friends, perhaps more involved in their community, and in society more broadly. And I think that that's a really exciting shift that I think is occurring. And I think for those of us who are coaches, there's a real, you know, there's a moment for us to really not become disenchanted, to really kind of lean into that, to do what we can to, you know, support, be out there connecting with people, perhaps connecting with organizations or leaders. I know here in the Netherlands, it's quite common for organizations to have sort of a pool of coaches that they will work with. And that doesn't necessarily mean that that coach is super busy through, you know, it does vary a lot of how that actually pans out in practice. But, you know, maybe having some conversations around that with the leaders in your network to see if you can step into that kind of role could be an interesting way of also perhaps building a market and helping people have those conversations as early as possible.
Oh, that's such a great answer, because that's my personal experience as well. When I first had coaching and I realized how valuable it is, I felt like, oh, I really wish I'd had this 5 or 6 years earlier as well. And I think my journey, like I would have avoided quite a lot of pain in my career journey. And yeah, I'd love to make that a reality for the younger generation. Um, from Miranda, thanks for this. Sally came into tonight looking for burnout advice and prevention, but I am now interested to explore working in this space. Thanks, Miranda. Yeah, I think there's so much we can cover here. So hopefully we'll get Sally in again to deep dive into burnout, which is such a huge topic on its own. So thanks, Miranda, and keep an eye out. We will dive into burnout as well. So it's such a important topic. Maybe one final meta question from me, Sally, before we sign off. I'm sure you're familiar with the Inner Development Goals organization. It's kind of taking this idea global, I suppose, this idea that one of the reasons that we haven't been able to make a lot of progress towards the sustainable development goals is because we lack the inner capacity to think about huge problems in that way, in an abstract way, and then make them concrete. So I guess looking like just blowing it out and expanding it out to that global level, what kind of impact do you see coaching having at that scale, at that global scale, across countries, across cultures, across everything?
Yeah, I'm going to try and keep this as short as possible because I feel like I could take up hours exponentially. My feeling is potentially revolutionary. I really feel that that coaching can be such a core aspect of how someone knows themselves more deeply, steps into their self-leadership and really transforms who they are to align much more closely with their authentic selves. That in itself is a little bit, I think, in the context of our economy and our societies, it's often quite a rebellious act of itself. And it takes courage. And that's where coaching can be such an incredibly powerful tool for support through that process. And I like to daydream about that idea of like, okay, that's the situation for one person. Imagine if this is hundreds of people. Imagine if this is, thousands of people, if this is organizations. The impact that it can have, I think, is really sky's the limit in some ways. I am a realistic optimist though, so I think there's also going to be some, there's going to be some barriers and some challenges that we face. But I do think that facilitating self-transformation for people is it's an incredibly impactful career as coaches, and it's also one that I think, and sometimes we can lose sight of it when we're just coaching back to back to back and it's dealing with one person at a time, but I really do think at a meta level, potentially revolutionary impact. That's just me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also love what you said earlier about helping younger generations avoid burnout entirely, and what does their career and life look like if that is possible.
It's one of those things that like when I look back, I have one regret, and that's that through my burnout, I really hurt the partner that I was with at the time. I regret that deeply. But I wouldn't, other than that, change anything about what I went through because it's brought me to where I am today. However, if I can help as many people as possible experience that transformation, that self-awareness, that authenticity without going through the debilitating experience of burnout, then I've left this world a better place. That's my goal.
Thank you so much, Sally. Before we close out, I'll quickly share my screen again, just putting this out there to people who are interested in either getting in touch with Sally or getting to know more about what we do. Thank you so much, Sally. That was an incredible discussion. I'm sure that so many of us here and many of the people who are going to watch this recording will have a lot of value from this. Sally is available through her website, which is up here. And yeah, we are Medoo. If you'd like to join our community, just scan that QR code. It will take you straight to our Slack community, which is free to join. And you'll be the first to hear about more of our events. We're planning to make as many of them online as possible so that we can reach as many people as possible, but we will be having in-person events in Sydney as well. So join our community, reach out to us, reach out to Sally, and yeah, we'll keep the conversation going. Thank you so much to everyone.
Thanks so much for having me, Pauline and Ella. It's been a delight, and thank you everyone for being here. It's inspiring.
You're incredible. Thank you, Sally. And with that, we'll sign off, and hope to see you all again soon.